Hey everybody, welcome back to DRTV. I'm your host, Jay Friesen.
And I'm Brian Mattson.
This is the Above the Paygrade segment where we typically have on somebody who's way smarter than us to talk about something we're interested in. Today, we are pleased to have with you, by day, Wesley J. Smith of the Discovery Institute. By night, the superhero, the philanthropist, lover of humanity, defender of the human race, mostly battling his arch-nemesis, Dr. Death. Wesley, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks very much.
We should get you some T-shirts or something, like the Philanthropist. That'd be cool.
A big giant P or something on the thing.
Wesley, we wanted to have you on the show because here in Montana, there is a bill in front of our legislature on the topic of physician-assisted suicide. And I know that you have written widely on this. You have a lot of expertise, and we're delighted to have you on DRTV to talk about this.
Well, welcome to the club. You know, the assisted suicide movement is on a blitzkrieg at the moment. It is using the tragedy of Brittany Maynard, and Brian, I saw you discuss that on one of your previous shows, and they're using her tragedy to try to kind of use it as a cudgel, if you will, to force assisted suicide into legalization through the sheer power of emotion as opposed to rational thinking. And it's a very precarious time at the moment.
It does seem to be a very emotional topic. I mean, Wesley, isn't it just about the alleviation of suffering? I mean, my sister was telling me she was in a conversation with some people, some older folks, and they were talking about this idea of the dying with dignity. And one of them said, well, you wouldn't let a dog or a horse suffer. Why would you let somebody else suffer?
You know, I asked my mother that same question when I was 8. Why is it that we can put down animals but not put down people? And she had my mother wasn't college educated, but she had a very good answer. She said, because people are different than animals. and that really makes a lot of sense. And when you think about the reasons why animals are euthanized, you have animals who are incontinent that are euthanized because they're messing up the couch. You have animals that are abandoned that are euthanized. You have animals that may be seriously ill, but people don't want to spend the money for the kind of care that could alleviate their suffering. So there is the idea that we should reduce our ethics to the level of veterinary medicine. And that's not putting down veterinary medicine, but what is proper in an animal context is not proper in a human context. That always strikes me as one of the least reasons why assisted suicide should be legalized.
One of the least.
One of the least.
Because that seems like that would be the number one argument that, okay, look, humans are different than animals.
Oh, no, I think he's saying that the idea that we wouldn't let a dog suffer is actually a bad argument, right? Is that
that's one of the least reasons to legalize it for human beings.
I follow you now. Right. So that does presume then that we are fundamentally different and more exceptional, if you will, than animals.
Yeah, it's interesting that has become my life's work, human exceptionalism, which we discussed, I think, on an earlier show when we talked about my book, The War on Humans. And the interesting thing is that what led me to the idea of the importance of human life and the attacks on it, which are cutting across a wide array of various issues, was the assisted suicide issue. That was my entry point into these various topics. And they're all connected. So assisted suicide is not a discrete issue kind of separated from, say, radical animal rights. It's part of a same paradigm that says human beings are just another animal in the forest.
Tell us a little bit, Wesley, about the history of this modern movement for euthanasia, assisted suicide, and I guess the poster child when I was growing up was Jack Kevorkian, of course, the Dr. Death. How did this arise? How have they made such huge advances in our culture?
I think the overriding purpose of culture is changing. Where once I think our society was seen as the first and foremost duty of society and of government was to protect the lives of all citizens, and that included people who were suicidal. People are increasingly seeing the purpose of culture and society and government is to prevent all suffering. Now, that's a utopian ideal because you can't prevent all suffering. You can mitigate it, which is a human obligation and is part of human exceptionalism, but you can't prevent it. And unfortunately, when you begin to think that the job is to prevent suffering, that suffering is the worst enemy there is, that quickly metastasizes into eliminating the sufferer. And so you now see that rather than taking the time and effort to care for people, to reduce their suffering, to have true compassion, which means to suffer with, that's the root meaning, we want to eliminate the problem quickly. And often, the Brittany Maynard case comes to mind once again. She wrote quite extensively as to why she wanted assisted suicide. One was she was afraid of future suffering, to the point that she wasn't even willing to try hospice because she was afraid it wouldn't work. And the second, and this one really breaks my heart, guys, she wrote more than once that she wanted to kill herself so that her family wouldn't see her go through decline. In other words, she wanted to put herself out of her family's misery. And that is a terrible thing. If my wife came to me and God forbid she had a terrible illness and said, you know, I don't want you to see me go through decline and have to experience the suffering which would be caused by watching me suffer, I'd say, how dare you try to force me to violate my marriage vows? I agreed to care for you and love you for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part, by which I meant natural death, not a suicide pill. So you also have the idea of the elderly people thinking they're burdens. Well, this is a terrible thing. We are letting people, and in fact, in Oregon, you see that many of the people commit assisted suicide not because of pain. In fact, very, very few people do it because of pain, because they're worried about being burdens. They're worried about losing the ability to engage in enjoyable activities. They're worried about losing the concept of dignity. But the people's dignity, the concept, comes from us when we visit them. We're mirrors. When they look in our face, I've been a hospice volunteer, and I'll tell you, the first thing when I saw a new patient, they'd look up at me and they'd search my face to see whether I still thought they were us or whether I now thought they were a them. So love requires turning away from this killing agenda, this death agenda, and into a caring agenda.
It seems like there's a lot of emphasis on people who might be considering this route, that they've lost hope, they've lost some semblance of identity and worth and value. How have you countered this when you do go visit the hospices, when you do the hospice? How have you countered some of this?
Hospice professionals cure it through interventions. I mean, it's a multidisciplinary system in which one of the things that I was taught, and that I was actually honored to interview Dame Cecily Saunders, who created the modern hospice movement. She is one of the great humanitarians of the 20th century. Well, and because of this assisted suicide movement, I think she doesn't get enough attention. But she said that she was adamantly opposed to assisted suicide because it denied the intrinsic dignity of her patients. And therefore, she said that what we do if somebody who has a terminal illness is suicidal is the same thing we would do if somebody wanted to kill themselves because their family had been killed or because their business had collapsed. We intervene with suicide prevention. And studies have shown that people with terminal illnesses who have received those kinds of interventions often, not always, but often are glad that they didn't kill themselves. But even I have made in my discussion here, have created a misnomer. This is not about terminal illness. Euthanasia and assisted suicide has a premise. That premise is that killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering. Once you accept that premise, the concept of terminal illness is just a way station, because there are a lot of people who suffer far longer than the terminally ill, and who suffer far more extremely than the terminally ill. Often people with mental illnesses, for example, who would say, well, if somebody who's dying and not suffering as much as me and not suffering for as long as me can have assisted suicide, why can't I? And sure. in most countries that do allow this, the Netherlands, Belgium, Quebec, the province, the recent Canadian Supreme Court that just created a charter right to euthanasia throughout that country, and not just for the terminally ill, but also for people with disabilities and psychological suffering. Most places do not have that terminal illness limitation. People have to understand the terminal illness limitation you see in Oregon is just a premise. It's just a pretense.
Like a halfway house.
Yes, it's to get people to accept the premise. Once the premise is accepted, killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering, while the sheer force of human logic takes us to where you end up with near death on demand, which is what is happening now in Belgium and in the Netherlands.
Seems to me, Wesley, we've got here a worldview clash, and you've highlighted it really well. One says, is a utopian view, suffering is the greatest enemy. That is what we must avoid. And of course, our audience generally are Christians and people from a Christian worldview where suffering is contextualized. You know, Paul says in Romans 8, "For I consider that the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed," that suffering is not the ultimate enemy.
That's right. And also we have, as Christians, the obligation to alleviate each other's suffering.
Right.
It is an opportunity for ministry. That is a Christian premise. And of course, we should not, Christians should never allow anyone to die alone. Look at what Mother Teresa did. Mm-hmm. Mother Teresa is one of the great humanitarians of our time. And she went to the very poorest places in India where people were literally dying in the streets with maggots coming out of their bodies. And she brought them home and held them and cared for them. That is the proper model for caring for people who are dying or for suffering for any cause. Do you know that in Belgium, by the way, guys, they have now coupled euthanasia with organ harvesting?
Oh, my.
And the people that they are pursuing for that, and I've written about this because it's been written up in medical journals, they're looking for people with neuromuscular disabilities, such as people with multiple sclerosis, or the mentally ill because they have good organs. Yeah. And I read one, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but it's true. I read one article in a respected organ transplant journal where 4 patients had been harvested who had been euthanized. 3 of them were disabled people, and 1 was mentally ill. And do you know what the mental illness was? Self-harm. So the cure for self-harm was to be killed and harvested. Now, I can't think of anything more dangerous for a despairing person trying to live with a disability or live with a mental illness than thinking that their deaths have greater value than their lives. Well, one, if society accepts that premise, and at that point, you will see Katie bar the door, which is why, by the way, disability rights activists are perhaps the best opponents of assisted suicide and euthanasia. They come from a secular perspective overall. They tend to be politically liberal, but they say, wait a second, you want to kill people who have symptoms and lives like we experience. We're the targets of this movement. And indeed, they're right. They are the targets, which is why we should not let this thing go forward, and we should resist the killing agenda and redouble our efforts at caring.
Well, you know, if you have a worldview that is nothing but we're a sum of our parts, we're just a bunch of random molecules, we have no worth beyond fate and chance, this makes a lot of sense. It really does. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. There's no point but the suffering. There's no, I live in a free America, I can turn around and kill myself if I want to because it's my right.
Yeah, but Jay, we're not talking about kill myself. We're talking about getting assistance and getting me dead. So we're not talking about an individual autonomous act. We are talking about a conspiracy to make somebody dead. Suicide is not against the law in terms of the criminal law, but that doesn't mean there's a right to kill yourself. If I do a terrible job on this program and I get in despair and I decide to drive 25 miles from here to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, the police can physically compel me not to jump. In fact, ironically, they're putting suicide barriers on that bridge because so many people jump. And that's because there isn't a right to kill oneself. And indeed, if I am found beyond a reasonable doubt to be a terrible danger to my own life, I can be hospitalized for treatment.
Right. Wow.
So there's no right to suicide. It's not against the criminal law, because if you kill yourself, well,
How do they charge you?
yeah, it kind of misses the point. And if you fail at killing yourself, the proper thing isn't jail, it's care. So it's not only do people not have a right to kill themselves, but the euthanasia assisted suicide movement isn't about that. It is about somebody jointly taking that action to make sure somebody else dies, either through assisting that person kill themselves or through killing them through, say, a lethal
I
injection.
love that distinction you just made there.
Yeah. Now let me ask this, Wesley. What is the state of the medical community? I mean, you've just made that wonderful case right there that we're talking about a conspiracy to make somebody dead. Is this medical care? Are doctors behind this?
Well, mostly it's through most of medical history. It hasn't been. The Hippocratic Oath, which is 2,500 years old and predates Christianity by about 500 years, prevents, doctors are required to agree, I will not assist somebody in suicide. Most medical, even though doctors don't take the Hippocratic Oath anymore because it conflicts with modern ethical sensibilities and morality with regard to abortion-assisted suicide. Even the Hippocratic Oath said that the doctor is not to have sex with patients, and even that is now out of the quote oaths. They're just pablum now.
No kidding.
Most doctors take. The only thing that basically remains from the Hippocratic Oath is patient privacy. But doctors have never been into killing. I mean, of course, beyond rogues, and today, most medical associations still oppose assisted suicide. Unfortunately, Canada's medical association supports the right now, they're calling it a therapeutic action. And so you're beginning to see the surrender of some medical associations. But the American Medical Association, for example, remains opposed to legalizing assisted suicide and to doctors performing that as part of their duties.
Great. Well, you've touched on it a little bit, but maybe just give us a little bit of a bigger window. This has been tried in various places. You mentioned Holland and Belgium. What have been the societal consequences of legalizing physician-assisted suicide?
Well, you've seen what is sometimes called the slippery slope, but it's facts on the ground. For example, in the Netherlands, Dutch doctors have been allowed to euthanize patients first through a decriminalized, now a legalized paradigm, and they've gone from killing the terminally ill who ask for it, to the chronically ill who ask for it, to people with disabilities who ask for it, to the elderly, quote, tired of life who ask for it. Even mental illness is now grounds for euthanasia in the Netherlands. About 50 or 60 mentally ill patients who are not otherwise physically ill are euthanized by psychiatrists. And you see in Dutch medical journals, psychiatrists writing that this is a liberation for the patient and the psychiatrist. I mean, it's just incredibly harmful. In Belgium, which has gone even more kind of head first off the cliff, you recently had a transgendered person who was unhappy with her sex change surgery getting euthanized because of that. You had a woman, a psychiatric patient, who had been sexually exploited by her psychiatrist. She reported into the authorities when nothing was done to punish that psychiatrist. She went to another psychiatrist who euthanized her as a consequence. And the bitter irony is 6 months later, the first psychiatrist was delicensed. You've had, this one. You now have elderly couples in Belgium who don't want to face potential widowhood having joint euthanasia killings. Joint euthanasia killings.
Kind of a culture of death.
I would say with capital C and capital D. The same thing is happening in Switzerland, where they have suicide clinics. Switzerland is Jack-of-Working as a country. People fly into Switzerland to be made dead. There was one Italian woman who went there last year because she was so upset about having lost her look. She was an elderly woman. She didn't think she was pretty anymore. And the first the family knew that she was dead was when the suicide clinic sent them her ashes.
Oh.
I mean, this is cruel. It's abandoning, but it's the logic.
Wow.
What, as Christians, walking away from this discussion, there's a lot to take away. What is some biblical grounding and some encouragement you can give to us as Christians as we're starting to face this issue a little bit?
Well, I think that would be Brian's position better than my position. I'm not a theologian. But I think what I would urge people is to look and talk with their Christian pastors, with people like Brian, theologians, to get a proper understanding. But realize it's not just a Christian or religious issue. This is an essential public policy issue. And so you have atheists opposing legalizing, such as Nat Hentoff. Nat Hentoff is a well-known atheist. He wrote for 50 years for the Village Voice, a man of the left. He's one of the great voices against euthanasia and assisted suicide, to the point that the Human Life Foundation, that publishes Human Life Review, named him a great defender of life about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was honored that he asked that I come and introduce him, and was able to do that. And I have found that every time I've written something, Nat Hentoff was there before I was. So it's not just a religious issue. It's an ethical issue, it's a moral issue, and it's a public policy issue. And of course, unfortunately, some Christians support this agenda. The Episcopalians, I believe, the Episcopalian Church support it. I know the United Church of Christ supports it. And that's, these churches that tend to go along with modern cultural approaches that want to be in and of the world tend to support this, whereas more orthodox with the small o churches oppose it. The Eastern Orthodox Church opposes, the Catholic Church opposes, more evangelical, Orthodox evangelical churches oppose. But it's not a religious issue per se. It is a moral, ethical, and public policy issue.
Yeah, and I think you actually did answer Jay's question earlier, because you were making the point that our duty is love, and it is care, and it's not helping somebody kill themselves. It is to affirm their dignity, made and created in the image of God.
That's right, and even if they can't see it themselves, none of us know where we might be. We're not to judge somebody who becomes suicidal. We're to help them get through that darkness. That's love. That's care. That's a Christian involvement with somebody's life in a positive and a beneficial sense.
Yeah, and that would be a profound culture if that was the ethic infused into a culture.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Wesley, where can people keep in touch with you? How can they keep in touch with you? What do you want to tell them to go look at?
I have the Human Exceptionalism blog on National Review online. That's nationalreview.com. Hit the Human Exceptionalism blog, and as I think you both know, I tweet. I'm on Twitter, and the address is @ForcedExit, which is the name of my book on euthanasia, Forced Exit, @ForcedExit. And I always post my articles and my blog articles and my other articles on my Twitter. People can keep in touch with me that way.
Yeah, and Wesley's written a lot of things. You can look at his book, War on Humans. It's also a website, I believe, War on Humans, that deals with environmental issues. I really love your book, Wesley, A Rat is a Pig, is a Dog, is a Boy, on animal rights versus animal welfare. Excellent, excellent book. So check out Wesley's writings. He's a super great writer, and you'll enjoy it very much.
And can I make one more point?
Sure.
The time for complacency is over. A lot of times I'll give speeches and people will roll their eyes and say, oh, what will they think of next? It can't happen here. It is happening here. And the sense I'm getting, particularly among Christians and pro-lifers that I talk to, they're not the only people I talk to, obviously, but in these audiences, is a sense of exhaustion. A sense that, all right, just do whatever you want, just leave me alone. The problem is they're not going to leave you alone. And so we don't have the luxury of unengagement. We must be involved in these issues, and we must stand for what is right, virtuous, and true.
As one of our good friends says, we will be made to care.
Yes, we will.
Well, thank you, Wesley.
Well said, well said.
Thank you so much.
Hey, I love the new set, guys.
Hey, thanks.
I like it
Looks
too.
good.
We love it. So.
Fantastic.
Christian hipsters.
Uh-oh.
Oh, boy.
Oh, dear. We're going to have to change our wardrobe, Jay. People keep calling us this.
I'm shaving the head again. I'll start wearing the flat bills and the hoodies.
That's great. Wesley, great talking with you. Thanks for coming on again.
And thanks for your work. I watch you guys every week and enjoy it every time.
Awesome. Great.
To follow us on all of our social medias, www.deadreckoning.tv. I'm Jay Friesen.
And I'm Brian Mattson.
And this is DRTV.